Welcome to Stories TH, where incredible stories of survival and betrayal come to life. In today's video, we bring you the heart-pounding story of a man who was buried alive, only to rise again and uncover the truth behind the lies that almost cost him his life. It's a tale filled with twists, emotions, and shocking revelations you won't believe. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, Stories TH, so you never miss out on more amazing stories like this one. Life before the fake death. Samuel's hard life. Samuel Turner was a man of grit and determination. Living on a small farm tucked away in the rolling hills of the countryside, he and his family led a life that many might describe as humble, if not a little too difficult. Samuel's day began before the first light of dawn, as the rooster's crow echoed across the land, signaling the start of another grueling day. From the moment Samuel rose from his bed, his mind was already consumed with the daily tasks that kept the farm running. The barn needed cleaning, the crops had to be tended to, and the animals required constant care. But none of these responsibilities were too burdensome for Samuel. He worked tirelessly, his hands calloused and worn from years of labor, his back sore from the never-ending hours spent hunched over in the fields. Despite the hardships, Samuel was content. He had a family he loved dearly: his wife, Clara, and their daughter, Lucy. Clara, a woman of great strength and kindness, supported Samuel through the toughest times. She worked alongside him, tending to the house and the garden, making sure they had enough food to survive the seasons. Her love for Samuel was evident in the way she cared for their small home, turning it into a warm sanctuary in the midst of their struggles. Their daughter, Lucy, was the light of their lives. Despite the challenges of growing up in a poor, rural environment, Lucy radiated joy. Her laughter could often be heard echoing through the farm, her small feet running across the dirt paths as she played in the garden or chased the chickens. Samuel and Clara cherished every moment with her, knowing that life could be fleeting and that these small joys were their greatest treasures. But even as Samuel worked tirelessly to provide for his family, the weight of his life's circumstances was always present. They lived in constant fear of drought, unpredictable weather, and the unforgiving reality of a life that relied heavily on the land. The money was never enough, and they were always a few days away from the edge, struggling to make ends meet. In the evenings, after a long day's work, Samuel would sit on the porch with Clara. They would watch the sun set over the hills, the sky turning shades of orange and purple as the stars slowly emerged. It was during these quiet moments that Samuel would reflect on the life they had built together, simple but filled with love. Though their material possessions were few, their bond was unbreakable. Yet, despite the peace they found in each other's company, Samuel knew that life was not always kind. They had no choice but to face the brutal truth that the farm was barely profitable, and at times, it felt like the world was against them. His dreams of expanding the farm, of providing a better life for Clara and Lucy, seemed like distant fantasies. The farm required constant repairs, and the crops had to be carefully monitored to ensure survival. But all of this work, though exhausting, was part of the life Samuel had chosen. It was the life he had promised to provide for his family, no matter the cost. The Turner family lived by the values of hard work and resilience, but it wasn't just the daily grind that shaped Samuel's existence. The deep love he shared with Clara and Lucy gave him the strength to endure the toughest of times. However, Samuel often found himself wishing for something more: a chance at a life where the burdens of financial struggle didn't hang over them every day. He longed for the freedom to breathe, to enjoy the simple pleasures without the constant fear of failing. Little did Samuel know, his life was about to be thrown into a whirlwind of deception and betrayal. The peace they shared would soon be shattered by a series of events that would alter their lives forever. The unthinkable would happen: Samuel would be betrayed by those closest to him. The fake death that would follow would change the course of his life, testing his resilience and his love for his family in ways he never imagined. But for now, Samuel focused on the here and now: the love of his family, the satisfaction of a day's hard work, and the fleeting moments of happiness that, despite everything, made life worth living. For Samuel, the difficulties were never enough to break his spirit, though they weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was a man who carried the burden of his family's survival without complaint, quietly bearing the pain and exhaustion so that his loved ones could rest easy. Yet, as the days went by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, a sense of fulfillment beyond just surviving. In those rare moments when he allowed himself to think about the future, Samuel would dream of a time when they could leave the farm behind and start anew. Maybe somewhere warm, where the crops grew easily and the air was sweet. Somewhere where Clara could wear a new dress and Lucy could go to school, not just work the land. But such dreams felt impossibly far away, like distant stars that would forever remain out of reach. Little did he know, the path he had worked so hard to carve out for his family would soon be threatened. And in the darkened corners of their lives, secrets and lies had already begun to fester, setting the stage for an unimaginable betrayal that would shatter everything Samuel held dear. But at this moment, life was simple, filled with hard work, love, and the quiet hope that somehow things would get better. In this first section of the story, we explore Samuel's life as a hard-working, humble man who struggles to provide for his family on a small farm. The narrative focuses on the daily challenges he faces, the bond he shares with his wife and daughter, and the dreams he holds for a better future. While Samuel's life is difficult, there is a sense of peace and fulfillment that comes from his family and his work. However, beneath this surface, the seeds of betrayal are already being sown, and the life Samuel knows is about to be turned upside down. This section sets the stage for the drama and suspense that will unfold in later parts of the story. Family relationships and the tension with Henry. While Samuel's life on the farm was far from easy, he found solace in the love of his wife Clara and their daughter Lucy. However, there was always an underlying tension that gnawed at the edges of their happiness: his strained relationship with Clara's brother, Henry. Though they shared family ties, Samuel never quite felt comfortable around Henry. There was something about him that rubbed Samuel the wrong way, something beneath the surface that made Samuel uneasy. Henry was a man driven by self-interest, and his jealousy towards Samuel's life and the Turner family's modest success was palpable. He wasn't accustomed to hard work and resented the life of struggle that Samuel had chosen. Instead of embracing the hard-earned success of his sister's family, Henry viewed their humble existence with disdain, believing that Samuel and Clara deserved more than what they had worked so hard to achieve. The tension between them grew steadily, festering under the surface like an untreated wound. Samuel, for his part, tried to be patient. He understood that Henry was a man of wealth and status, someone who had never had to worry about making ends meet. Henry's life was one of comfort, and it was easy for him to look down on Samuel's lifestyle with its constant struggles and sacrifices. Still, Samuel kept his thoughts to himself. He had never been one to stir the pot or create unnecessary conflict. His focus was always on his family, on ensuring that Clara and Lucy had the best life he could provide despite the challenges they faced. Yet, despite Samuel's attempts to stay out of conflict, the cracks in the relationship with Henry kept growing. It was clear that Henry's jealousy was becoming more pronounced, particularly as the Turner family continued to work hard and build their life. Samuel noticed the way Henry would often speak down to him, offering unsolicited advice on how to manage the farm, always with an air of superiority. But Samuel remained quiet, understanding that it was just Henry's nature to belittle others. The turning point came when Henry approached Samuel with a proposal that Samuel would never have imagined. One evening, as the sun set over the farm, Henry arrived unannounced. He had that familiar, calculating look on his face, the same look Samuel had come to recognize as Henry's trademark. Samuel was in the barn, working on some repairs, when Henry walked in and began talking about a new business venture. "Samuel, you're sitting on a gold mine, you know that?" Henry said, a grin playing on his lips. Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow, unsure of what Henry was implying. "What are you talking about, Henry?" Samuel asked, his voice cautious. Henry's eyes gleamed with an unsettling excitement. The land you've got here, it's prime real estate. I've been talking to some developers and they're looking to build a luxury resort. All we need to do is sell this land, and you could make enough money to live like a king for the rest of your life." Samuel's heart sank. He had worked tirelessly for years to keep the farm running, and the land was all he had left. It was the only thing that had tied his family to the land, the only thing that kept him rooted in his family's history. The thought of selling it, of giving up the land that had sustained them for generations, was unfathomable. "I won't sell, Henry," Samuel said firmly, his voice steady. "This land is not for sale. It's our home." Henry's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Come on, Samuel. Think about it. You're barely scraping by as it is. You could move somewhere nicer, have a proper life for Clara and Lucy. They deserve it, don't they?" he pressed, his voice growing more insistent. Samuel shook his head, his grip tightening around the wrench he had been holding. "I've worked too hard for this land to let it go. We made a life here. This is what's best for my family. It's not about the money, Henry." Henry's face darkened with frustration, his eyes narrowing. "You're being foolish. You don't know what's best for your family. I'm just trying to help you, but you're too stubborn to see it. You could be living in a mansion with all the comforts you've never had. Don't be stupid." Samuel felt the heat rise in his chest, anger mixing with the anxiety that had been building inside him ever since Henry started pushing for the land. He could feel his fists clenching, the stress of years of constant struggle and sacrifice bubbling up to the surface. But he knew that he couldn't give in, no matter how much Henry pushed. "No, Henry," Samuel said quietly, but with undeniable firmness. "This farm is my family's legacy. I will not sell it for anything, not for all the wealth in the world." Henry was silent for a moment, his eyes dark with barely contained anger. The conversation had gone, as Samuel expected. It always came back to money, and Samuel had no intention of giving in. But Henry wasn't a man who easily accepted defeat. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to Samuel, and for a brief moment, Samuel thought he saw something dangerous flicker behind Henry's gaze. "Fine," Henry muttered, his voice low and filled with venom. "But don't come crying to me when your little farm collapses. I gave you the chance, Samuel. It's on you now." With that, Henry turned and stormed out of the barn, slamming the door behind him. Samuel stood there for a long moment, staring after his brother-in-law. The tension between them was now at its breaking point, and Samuel knew it wouldn't end here. Henry's words echoed in his ears, and despite himself, Samuel felt a wave of doubt wash over him. Was he really making the right choice? Was he holding on to something that was slowly suffocating him and his family? But no matter how hard it got, Samuel refused to let go of the land. It was more than just dirt and crops. It was his identity, his history, and his future. His family had lived on this land for generations, and he would not let it slip through his fingers, no matter how much money Henry promised. The tension between Samuel and Henry was now undeniable, and it was clear that their relationship had become irreparably damaged. What started as a simple disagreement had morphed into a deep, seething rift. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was brewing, that Henry's bitterness and jealousy were only going to escalate from here. And soon, Samuel would realize just how far Henry was willing to go to get what he wanted. The conspiracy and the fake death. Henry's devious plot. After failing to convince Samuel to sell the family farm, Henry's bitterness grew into something far darker. His pride had been wounded, and his greed, which had always simmered beneath the surface, now festered into something poisonous. Samuel's refusal to part with the land was more than just a rejection of his offer. It was a personal affront to Henry, who had always seen himself as entitled to a better life, regardless of the cost. The idea of someone, especially Samuel, standing in the way of his ambitions was unbearable to Henry. It was clear that the subtle manipulation he had attempted had failed, and now he felt there was only one way to resolve the situation: by removing Samuel entirely. As the days passed, Henry brooded in silence, his mind working furiously to come up with a plan. His thoughts swirled with possibilities, and one particularly sinister idea began to take shape. If Samuel would not willingly hand over his land, then perhaps he could be removed from the picture permanently. Samuel, after all, was a simple man who worked the land from dawn to dusk. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't well-connected, and his family had no power to stop him. To Henry, this was a perfect opportunity, a perfect moment to take what was rightfully his. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a shade of fiery red, Henry met with a man he had long known for his questionable morals, Dr. Martin Keller, a disgraced physician with no scruples when it came to money. Dr. Keller had once been part of a prestigious medical practice, but had been expelled due to his illegal activities, including issuing fake medical certificates for anyone who paid him handsomely. Henry, aware of Keller's reputation, had approached him with the idea of faking Samuel's death. At first, Keller had been reluctant, but after Henry promised him a generous sum of money and further favors, the doctor reluctantly agreed. The plan was deceptively simple. Samuel, the hard-working farmer, was used to long hours and physical strain. Henry had observed him carefully and knew that Samuel sometimes took a nap after working tirelessly in the fields. One night, Henry slipped into the Turner family home unnoticed, bringing with him a sedative that would knock Samuel out cold, rendering him unconscious and, to all appearances, dead. The drug would slow Samuel's heart rate and breathing, making it difficult for anyone to notice that he was still alive. Henry intended to leave Samuel dead long enough to get a fake death certificate and a burial arranged before anyone could realize the truth. The plan unfolded without a hitch. As Samuel came in from working late that evening, tired from the day's labor, he sat down for a brief dinner with his family. The conversation was lighthearted, and for a moment, he forgot the mounting tensions with Henry. Samuel kissed Clara goodnight and played with Lucy for a few minutes before heading to bed. It was then that Henry, having disguised himself, entered through the back door of the Turner house, where Samuel slept. He quietly moved over to Samuel's bed and injected the sedative into his arm. The effect was almost immediate. Samuel's body went limp, and his breathing became slow and shallow. Henry, standing over him, waited for a few minutes to ensure that Samuel was completely out. He checked Samuel's pulse, confirming that it was dangerously slow, but not entirely absent. It was enough for Henry. Satisfied with the outcome, he made his way to the next step in his scheme. Henry then made a phone call to Dr. Keller, who had agreed to meet him under the cover of darkness. A few hours later, Dr. Keller arrived at the Turner household, and together they began the next phase of their plan, the forging of Samuel's death certificate. The doctor checked Samuel's vital signs and, seeing that he was unconscious, hastily declared him dead. With no one else to verify the situation and no one expecting foul play, the doctor quickly prepared a false death certificate. He signed it, sealing Samuel's fate as far as the paperwork was concerned. The two men worked efficiently, knowing that time was of the essence. The next morning, when Clara woke to find her husband seemingly dead, she was in shock. She had no idea that the love of her life had been taken from her in such a cruel and calculated manner. At first, she thought it was just another nightmare, but when she saw the lifeless body of Samuel, the horror of the situation set in. Henry, ever the manipulator, played his role with convincing sorrow, offering his condolences and reassuring Clara that everything would be handled with respect and dignity. Before long, the news spread, and the entire town gathered for Samuel's funeral. Clara, unable to comprehend the loss, clung to their daughter, Lucy, who was too young to understand the enormity of what had just happened. Henry oversaw the arrangements, acting the part of the concerned brother-in-law, all the while secretly relishing in the success of his twisted plan. As the funeral proceeded, the townspeople gathered around, exchanging whispered condolences. Clara's grief was palpable, but in the midst of it all, she was unaware that her husband had not really died. The funeral proceeded without incident, and Samuel's body was laid to rest in the ground. It was only after the funeral, as the family and friends returned to their homes, that the first signs of doubt began to creep into Clara's mind. Despite the official documents and the finality of the burial, something felt wrong. Clara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Samuel hadn't been taken by natural causes. As she stood before his grave, her heart ached, and she swore to herself that she would find out the truth. Little did she know that the journey ahead would uncover the terrifying truth of what had really happened to Samuel. Henry, however, was confident that the worst was over. He believed that with Samuel out of the picture, the land would soon be his. Clara would have no choice but to sell, and Henry would finally get everything he wanted. But what he failed to realize was that the truth had a way of coming to light, and Samuel Turner's story was far from over. Clara and Lucy's suspicion. Clara Turner had always been a woman of deep intuition. Even as she sat in the quiet of their small home, the weight of grief pressing down on her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Samuel's death had come too suddenly, too violently. She could hardly believe it. Her husband, her devoted, hard-working husband, had been taken from her in the blink of an eye. The sense of loss was unbearable, and yet something gnawed at Clara, an unsettling thought that wouldn't leave her mind. As days passed in the wake of Samuel's funeral, Clara's grief transformed into a quiet, persistent unease. She could feel the heavy weight of his absence, but she also felt an undeniable emptiness in the way everything unfolded so quickly. The circumstances surrounding his death didn't sit well with her. She knew Samuel. She knew his health, his habits, his routines. The idea that he could have simply collapsed and died without warning seemed out of place. It wasn't that Clara was in denial. She wasn't rejecting the notion of her husband's death. Rather, it was the finality of it all, the suddenness with which he had been taken from her, that felt wrong. At night, when the house was quiet and the lights were dim, Clara found herself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about the funeral, about the coffin being lowered into the cold, hard earth. She had been there, standing in the crowd, but something about that moment felt distorted. The image of her husband's lifeless body was seared into her memory, but she couldn't let go of the strange suspicion that had taken root in her heart. The most disturbing thing of all was the faint sound she had heard, just before the coffin was closed. It was barely perceptible, but Clara was certain she had heard an almost imperceptible scratching noise, followed by a soft thump. At first, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, a symptom of the shock and grief she was experiencing. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that something about that sound had been undeniably real. Clara shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. Surely she was just imagining things. After all, Samuel had been declared dead by a doctor. He had been pronounced lifeless in front of a room full of witnesses. The paperwork was official. The funeral had been completed with all the necessary rites. Samuel was gone. Yet, the sound lingered in her mind, and the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong only grew stronger. It wasn't just the sound that bothered Clara. The whole situation had unfolded too quickly. She recalled how Henry, her brother, had been so eager to take charge of everything, stepping in with his usual air of authority. He had arranged the funeral with military precision, as if he were orchestrating a play, and Clara had barely had the chance to process everything before the burial had taken place. At times, he had seemed almost too eager, too anxious to get the ceremony over with. His demeanor was polite, but there was a coldness to him that Clara had never noticed before. Clara turned to her daughter, Lucy, for comfort. The young girl had been too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but Clara could see the sadness in her eyes, the way Lucy would ask when her father was coming home. It broke Clara's heart every time, and she knew that Lucy would never fully grasp the loss they had both suffered. But there was something else in Lucy's behavior that made Clara uneasy. The little girl had become strangely quiet in the days following Samuel's death. She would often stare out the window, lost in thought, her tiny hands curled into fists. One afternoon, as Clara sat with Lucy in the garden, she watched her daughter play with a small wooden toy, her brow furrowed in concentration. Clara's mind wandered back to the night of the funeral, and suddenly, Lucy's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mom, why was Daddy's coffin so heavy?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at her daughter, who seemed to be lost in thought, her small hands tracing the edges of the wooden toy. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Clara asked, her voice soft and uncertain. "I don't know," Lucy said slowly, her eyes not meeting Clara's. It just felt really heavy when they carried it. And there was something inside it, like something was moving. I heard it, Mom. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Her daughter, so young and innocent, had heard something that Clara herself had dismissed as a figment of her imagination. Lucy wasn't old enough to understand the weight of what she was saying, but her words cut through Clara's mind like a knife. The doubt that Clara had tried to suppress for days now roared to the surface. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Samuel's death didn't feel right, and Lucy's comment, as innocent as it was, had sparked a fire of suspicion in Clara's heart. She had to know the truth. Determined to get answers, Clara began to quietly investigate. She started by questioning the doctor who had signed Samuel's death certificate, but his responses were vague, almost rehearsed. He assured Clara that everything had been done according to protocol, but Clara wasn't convinced. The more she thought about the doctor's indifference, the more suspicious it became. She had known Samuel's health intimately, and the idea that he had simply died without warning didn't align with her knowledge of him. Clara also began to piece together the timeline of events, looking for any inconsistencies. She remembered how Henry had insisted on taking control of the funeral arrangements, but he had been so quick to dismiss her questions. When Clara had asked to see the body one last time, Henry had refused, claiming it was best for her to remember Samuel as he had been, without the harsh realities of death. But Clara's gut told her that there was more to the story. There had to be. And so, she began to search for any hidden clues, any traces that could reveal the truth. As she scoured the house for answers, her thoughts often drifted to the strange sound she had heard, the thump that seemed to echo in her mind. It was clear now Samuel hadn't died. He was still alive, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the world believed he was dead. Clara felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. She knew that whatever lay ahead, it wouldn't be easy. But she had to find Samuel, for herself, for Lucy, and for the man she had loved with all her heart. The truth unveiled. Discovery that Samuel is still alive. The church was quiet, save for the soft murmur of prayer that echoed through the worn stone walls. The dim light filtered in from the tall, narrow windows, casting a serene glow across the congregation. Clara sat in a pew, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes cast downward. The weight of her grief hung heavy in the air around her. Samuel's death, though days passed, still haunted her, and no amount of time seemed to dull the ache in her heart. Yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, a question persisted: was Samuel truly gone? Clara's thoughts swirled like a storm, but she kept her gaze fixed on the altar. The rhythmic hum of the congregation's prayers seemed to offer some semblance of peace, if only for a moment. Lucy sat next to her, quietly drawing patterns on the wooden pew with her finger, as if the ritual of prayer could offer some comfort for her young soul as well. Suddenly, the serene stillness of the church was shattered by a loud, unmistakable thump. The sound was harsh, unmistakably coming from the back of the room. A series of rapid, heavy knocks rang out, like a hammer striking wood with violent force. Clara froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was coming from the direction of the graveyard, from the direction of the tomb, where Samuel had been laid to rest. Lucy, too, noticed the sound. The little girl's wide eyes darted toward her mother, confusion and concern painted across her innocent face. Clara's body tensed, and her pulse quickened. She looked around the church, half expecting someone else to acknowledge the noise, but no one did. The other villagers, deep in their own devotions, continued as though nothing had happened. But Clara could not ignore it. Her stomach tightened in fear, and an overwhelming sense of urgency rose within her. She knew that sound was not a product of her imagination. She had heard it before, the faint, unsettling noise that had echoed in her mind ever since the funeral. And now, in the quiet of the church, it had returned, louder and clearer than ever before. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her hand instinctively reached out to Lucy, clutching her daughter's small, trembling fingers. "Stay here," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure what the noise meant, but one thing was certain: it couldn't be ignored. Without thinking, Clara stood up, her feet moving quickly, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, but she didn't care. Her heart was focused solely on one thing: finding out what was happening. With every step, the noise grew louder in her mind, and the fear in her chest intensified. As Clara reached the door, a few other villagers stood up, following her, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. But Clara paid no mind to them. She needed to know what was going on. With Lucy following closely behind her, Clara hurried out of the church and toward the graveyard, the steps of the townspeople echoing in the distance. The graveyard was empty except for the freshly dug earth where Samuel's grave had been. The wind carried the faint scent of damp soil as Clara approached the tombstone. The villagers, now gathered behind her, murmured amongst themselves, unsure of what was happening. Clara's eyes fixed on the mound of dirt that marked Samuel's resting place, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was still echoing in her ears, reverberating through her mind like a heartbeat, and with each step, her urgency grew. As she neared the grave, she saw something strange: dirt shifting slightly on top of the freshly placed coffin. She paused, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Clara, what is it?" one of the villagers asked, but Clara didn't answer. Instead, her hands trembled as she bent down to examine the earth more closely. There, beneath the dirt, was the unmistakable shape of the coffin, its wooden exterior gently shifting, as though something was moving inside. Without a second thought, Clara dropped to her knees and began to clear the dirt away. Her hands were frantic as she dug, pushing the soil aside, trying to expose what she knew had to be there: her husband, Samuel. The sound from earlier grew louder, no longer a mere thump, but a desperate, rhythmic pounding. The villagers stood back, watching in stunned silence as Clara continued her frantic digging. Lucy, standing just behind her mother, looked up at the others with wide eyes. "Is Daddy alive?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Clara didn't respond at first. She was too consumed with her task, her hands covered in earth as she worked faster, her heart racing. The pounding from the coffin grew more frantic, and Clara's breath came in shallow bursts. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Clara's fingers brushed against the edge of the wooden coffin. She gasped, tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't imagined it. Samuel was alive. Desperate to reach him, Clara tugged at the lid of the coffin, her hands shaking. The villagers, stunned into action, rushed to help her. Together, they pried open the coffin, and there, lying inside, was Samuel. His face was pale, his skin cold to the touch, but his chest rose and fell, a faint but unmistakable sign that he was alive. Clara gasped in shock, her hands trembling as she gently touched his face. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking. Samuel's eyes fluttered open, his gaze bleary and confused. His lips parted, and in a weak voice he whispered, "Clara, Lucy." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she leaned over him, her hands gently brushing his hair away from his forehead. "You're alive. You're alive," she repeated, barely able to believe it. Samuel's eyes struggled to focus, but as he looked at Clara, a faint smile crept onto his face. It was weak, but it was enough. He was alive. He had survived against all odds. Clara held him close, overcome with emotion. It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. The villagers who had gathered around murmured in astonishment. Some were shocked beyond words, while others looked on with disbelief. But for Clara, the only thing that mattered in that moment was that Samuel had been returned to her. Against all odds, he had survived the cruel fate that had been thrust upon him. In the quiet of the graveyard, as the sun began to set, Clara and Samuel held each other. The truth was finally revealed. Samuel had not been dead after all. And with that revelation, a new chapter of their lives began, one filled with hope, determination, and the promise of justice for the wrongs that had been done. Henry faces retribution. The moment Samuel's miraculous survival was revealed to the village, the ripple of disbelief quickly turned into a wave of anger. Henry, the man responsible for the betrayal of not only his own brother-in-law, but his own blood, could no longer hide behind his facade of innocence. No longer could he manipulate the truth, deceive the authorities, or twist the narrative in his favor. The truth was now undeniable, and it was time for him to face the consequences of his wicked actions. As the police arrived at the church that fateful day, the entire town seemed to be in a state of suspended disbelief. Henry's cruel plot to murder Samuel had been exposed in the most dramatic of fashions through the desperate pounding from inside the coffin. The weight of his treachery now bore down on him like a suffocating storm, and the justice that had long evaded him was now closing in. Henry had always been a man of arrogance, pride, and deceit. He had built his life on the idea that power and wealth could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, standing before the authorities, he was nothing more than a desperate man, crumbling under the weight of his own crimes. The officers marched up to him, their presence overwhelming, and for the first time, Henry's usual composure faltered. He was no longer in control. With trembling hands, he was pulled from his home and handcuffed, dragged through the dirt streets as the villagers gathered, some watching in shock, others in grim satisfaction. The very people Henry had once looked down upon now turned their eyes toward him with contempt, the whispers of his betrayal and malice spreading like wildfire. "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Samuel Turner," the officer announced, his voice cold and unyielding. "For falsifying death certificates, conspiring to bury a man alive, and more." Henry's face twisted into a mixture of disbelief and anger. He tried to struggle, but the handcuffs were tight, the police officers firm and unyielding. "You can't do this. This is a mistake," he screamed, his voice high-pitched and frantic, but his protests fell on deaf ears. No one in the crowd showed any mercy for him. They had all seen too much the cruelty, the lies, the manipulation. The journey to the local jail was a humiliating one. As the officers ushered Henry into a small holding cell, his eyes darted around the room, searching for any escape. He was no longer the powerful, cunning man who had manipulated so many. Now he was trapped. The walls of the cell seemed to close in on him as he tried to gather his thoughts. But deep down, he knew that the walls were not the only thing closing in on him. His entire world was collapsing. Inside the town's courthouse, the trial was about to begin. The courtroom was filled with spectators, the villagers eager to see justice served. Clara, Samuel, and Lucy were among them, sitting silently, their faces filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. They had been through so much already, but now, the final chapter of this nightmare was about to unfold. Samuel, still recovering from the trauma of his near-death experience, was present as well, supported by Clara, his strength growing with each passing day as he finally faced the man who had tried to end his life. Henry was brought into the courtroom, his face pale and drawn, his eyes downcast. He had once been a man who commanded attention with his arrogance and authority, but now he looked like a broken man, defeated, fragile, and no longer the powerful figure he had once been. His suit, once carefully tailored, now seemed disheveled, a reflection of the unraveling life he had created for himself. The trial began with the prosecutor outlining the charges against Henry in a firm, authoritative tone. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged death certificate, the poison that had been found in Samuel's system, the testimony from the doctor who had been bribed to falsely declare Samuel dead, and, most damning of all, the confession from one of Henry's accomplices who had come forward, unable to live with the guilt of their role in the crime. "Henry Jimenez," the prosecutor called, "you are accused of attempting to murder Samuel Turner, a man you wronged, a man whose family you betrayed. You are accused of falsifying documents, of conspiring to kill him, and of treating his life with utter disregard for the sake of your own greed." The courtroom was silent as Henry, standing at the defendant's table, seemed to shrink in size. His once proud posture was now slumped, his hands trembling at his sides. His lawyer stood beside him, trying to offer some semblance of defense, but it was clear that Henry's fate had already been sealed. The truth was inescapable. Clara, her heart pounding in her chest, stood and addressed the court. Her voice, though steady, was filled with raw emotion. My husband, she said, her eyes meeting Henry's for the first time since his betrayal, was almost taken from me. You tried to kill him, and for what? Greed? Power? You tried to destroy our family, to take away everything we had, and you didn't care about the cost. Her words cut through the room like a blade. The truth of her pain, her loss, and her strength was evident to all who listened. Clara turned to look at Samuel, who sat by her side, a man reborn from the grave, his presence a testament to the love and determination that had kept him alive. Samuel spoke next, his voice gravelly but firm. Henry, you took everything from me. You took my life, my dignity, my chance to see my daughter grow up. But you couldn't take my spirit. You couldn't take my love for my family. I survived, and now you will pay for what you've done. Henry's face flushed with anger. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but no words came out. The weight of his actions crushed him. He had no defense, no argument that could change the fact that he was guilty. The courtroom was filled with the sound of Samuel's steady, unwavering voice, a voice that echoed with the power of a man who had been brought back from the dead and had seen the light of justice. Finally, the judge, a man known for his stern, fair rulings, stood and looked down at Henry with a piercing gaze. Henry Jimenez, he said, his voice unyielding, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison for your crimes. You will pay for what you have done, and justice will prevail. The verdict was met with a mix of emotions in the room: relief, satisfaction, and for some, a sense of closure. But for Clara, Samuel, and Lucy, it was more than just a sentence. It was the final piece of a shattered puzzle, the moment when they could finally begin to heal. As Henry was escorted out of the courtroom, his head hanging low, he realized that his years of manipulation and cruelty had come to an end. The justice that had eluded him for so long had finally found him. And as he was led away, there was no sympathy for him, only the knowledge that at last the wrongs had been righted and the broken family could begin to rebuild. Recovery and rebuilding the family. Samuel's recovery in the hospital. Samuel's first breath after awakening from his forced slumber was a sharp, desperate intake, as if the very act of drawing air into his lungs had been a luxury denied to him for too long. The bright, sterile lights of the hospital room contrasted sharply with the suffocating darkness of the grave, and for a moment, Samuel could hardly believe he was alive. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, yet the overwhelming sense of relief that washed over him was enough to keep him grounded in the present. Clara's face was the first thing he saw when his eyes fluttered open. She was sitting beside him, her tired eyes swollen from lack of sleep, but her gaze filled with such profound relief and joy that Samuel felt the weight of everything he had endured begin to melt away. Lucy, their daughter, stood at the foot of the bed, her small hands folded together in prayer, her innocent face filled with the kind of hope only a child could have. For Samuel, waking up to the sight of his wife and daughter was a reminder that, despite all the cruelty and pain that had been inflicted upon him, there was still love in the world. Clara and Lucy were his anchors, and it was their unwavering support that had brought him back from the brink of death. Samuel, Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she gently caressed his hand. You're awake. You're safe now. Samuel's lips parted, but his voice was weak and hoarse, like a rusted hinge being forced to turn. Clara, he rasped, his breath shallow. What happened? How long? Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she managed a small, encouraging smile. You were buried alive, she explained softly. But you made it, Samuel. You're going to be okay now. Samuel closed his eyes, processing the words. The sheer horror of what had happened, of what Henry had done to him, was almost too much to bear. But in that moment, he understood something that had eluded him for so long: the depth of love and strength that his family possessed. They had refused to let him die. They had fought for him, and because of that, he had a second chance. Over the next few days, Samuel's recovery was slow but steady. He was too weak to move at first, his body battered and bruised from the experience. The poison that had been injected into his system was still working its way out, but with each passing day, his body grew stronger. Clara never left his side, her comforting presence never once faltering. She would sit by his bedside, reading to him, talking to him, telling him stories of Lucy's antics, and all the little things that made their life together so beautiful. Despite the physical pain he endured, Samuel found solace in the sound of Clara's voice. It was a soothing balm to his weary soul. The nights were the hardest, though, when sleep would come to him in fits and starts. The memories of being trapped in the coffin, the sensation of suffocating, the helplessness, those were the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But every time he woke up, Clara was there, her steady presence guiding him back to reality. As the days turned into weeks, Samuel's strength gradually returned. His legs, weak and shaky at first, began to gain their strength back as he started to take small steps. His doctors were amazed by his recovery, and they attributed it to his sheer will to live and the unwavering support of his family. Clara had been his rock, the one who held him together when he felt like falling apart, and Lucy, despite her young age, was a constant source of joy and laughter. She would bring him little drawings she made, and Samuel could feel his heart swell with pride each time she showed him her latest creation. It wasn't just his physical recovery that took time, though. Samuel knew that healing his body would be the easiest part. The emotional scars left by the ordeal were far more complicated. The trauma of being betrayed by someone he had trusted, the anguish of nearly losing his life, and the emotional toll of not being there for Clara and Lucy, it was a burden he knew he couldn't carry alone. He would have to find a way to rebuild the trust, the love, and the peace in his family. Clara was a constant source of strength, but even she needed time to heal. She had been through so much, and it wasn't just her own fear for Samuel's life that had broken her, but the betrayal of her brother, Henry. The pain of watching the man she loved nearly die at the hands of her own flesh and blood was something Clara could never fully erase from her mind. But together, she and Samuel slowly started to rebuild. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but as long as they had each other, they were willing to face whatever came their way. It was during these quiet moments of healing that Samuel and Clara began to truly understand the depth of their bond. Samuel was no longer just a man who had survived a harrowing experience. He was a man reborn, someone who had been given a second chance at life, a chance to love his family with all his heart. And Clara, for her part, was learning to forgive not only Henry but also herself. She had fought for Samuel's life, and in doing so, she had found a strength within herself that she never knew existed. In the weeks that followed, Samuel and Clara began to return to their old routine. Samuel, still weak, would work short hours on the farm, with Clara and Lucy by his side. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain in his body would threaten to overwhelm him, but Samuel was determined to reclaim his life. They knew they had to move forward. The past, while painful, could no longer define them. It was time to rebuild, to heal, and to let go of the bitterness that had once consumed them. And through it all, Lucy remained their bright light, the one who reminded them of the simple joys of life. Her laughter filled their home, and it was her innocence, her unwavering belief in the goodness of the world, that helped them navigate the darkness. Samuel, now fully recovered, would often pick her up and spin her around in the yard, the two of them laughing as Clara watched from the porch, her heart swelling with gratitude. The family had been torn apart, but now, slowly, they were putting the pieces back together. And Samuel knew, deep in his heart, that as long as he had Clara and Lucy, he could face anything the world threw at him. Together, they would move forward stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The family rebuilds. The days following Samuel's recovery were filled with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. It was as though the Turner family had been given a second chance at life, a fresh start after enduring so much. Samuel's once frail body had become stronger with each passing day, but the scars of the past still lingered, hidden just beneath the surface. His body had healed, but his spirit needed more time. Time to rediscover his sense of security, time to rebuild the bond with his wife, Clara, and to remind himself of what truly mattered: his family. The first few weeks back at home were difficult for all of them. It wasn't just about rebuilding their house or repairing their land. It was about mending the emotional cracks that had formed during Samuel's absence. Clara had stood by him through it all, never wavering, but even she had been deeply scarred by what they had endured. The betrayal of her brother, Henry, still weighed heavily on her heart. Samuel's near-death experience had tested their marriage, but through it all, Clara never gave up. She had always believed in the strength of their love. For Samuel, the process of healing was not just physical. He was acutely aware of the deep emotional wound that had been inflicted upon their family. The guilt he felt for not being there for Clara and Lucy haunted him. He had almost lost them, and for that reason, he knew he had to make every effort to rebuild their lives to make up for the time they had lost and to prove to them that he was truly back and here to stay. One of the first steps in rebuilding their life was to return to the farm. The fields had become overgrown during Samuel's absence, and there was much work to be done. The crops that Samuel had worked so hard to grow had withered, and the once thriving farm had fallen into a state of neglect. The Turner family, however, was not one to give up easily. They knew that hard work and perseverance were the only things that would pull them out of the darkness. Samuel and Clara spent long hours together in the fields, planting new crops, repairing fences, and fixing what had been broken. They did it all with a renewed sense of purpose, each action a small step toward rebuilding the life they had once known. Samuel was determined to show Clara and Lucy that he would never allow anything, not even death, to take him away from them again. His love for them was the strongest force in his life, and it would drive him to keep going, no matter how difficult the road ahead was. Lucy, who had been so terrified during her father's disappearance, was gradually starting to heal as well. The bond she shared with Samuel was unbreakable, and the love between father and daughter had never wavered. Samuel would sit with her in the evenings, listening to her talk about her day, her dreams, and the things that made her smile. He had missed so much of her life, and now he was determined to make up for lost time. It was during these quiet moments that Samuel realized just how precious his family was. He had learned the hard way that time was something you could never get back. Clara, too, was finding her way back to normalcy. She had been the emotional pillar of the family throughout the crisis, but now it was time for her to heal as well. The grief of losing Samuel, the shock of his sudden return, and the betrayal of her brother had left their marks on her. But Clara was stronger than she had ever known. Samuel had always admired her resilience, but now, seeing her in the quiet moments when she thought no one was watching, he realized just how much she had sacrificed for the family. She was not only his wife, she was the backbone of their family, the heart that kept them all beating. As the months passed, the Turner family found their rhythm again. The farm began to prosper once more, and the once neglected fields flourished under their care. The crops grew strong and healthy, just as their bond had. Samuel worked harder than ever, determined to make up for the time he had lost, and Clara was right by his side, working alongside him every step of the way. Lucy, growing older with each passing day, continued to bring light and joy to their home. Her laughter filled the air, and Samuel couldn't help but marvel at how much she had grown since he had been gone. Through all of this, the family had learned an invaluable lesson, one that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. They had learned that love, especially the love within a family, could overcome even the greatest obstacles. Samuel had been betrayed by his brother-in-law, nearly killed, and buried alive, but he had come back. Clara had been devastated by the loss of her husband, but she never gave up hope. Lucy had faced the terrifying prospect of losing her father forever, but her love for him had never faltered. The Turner family had come through the storm, and they were stronger for it. Samuel knew that the love and trust they had in each other was the foundation that would carry them through anything that came their way. They were a family united, resilient, and unbreakable. They had learned that no matter how difficult life became, they would always have each other, and that, more than anything else, was the greatest gift they could ever have. As they worked together to rebuild their farm, Samuel and Clara began to look to the future with hope. They had come through the darkest time of their lives, and now they had the opportunity to create something new, something better. Their journey had been long and painful, but the love that had carried them through the storm was now the guiding light that would lead them forward. The Turner family was whole again, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The past had tried to break them, but it had only made them stronger. And as they looked out over the fields they had restored, they knew that nothing would ever tear them apart again. They had rebuilt their lives, and now they would rebuild their future together. Justice and forgiveness. Justice is served. The trial of Henry Jimenez was a turning point for the Turner family, a moment when the weight of betrayal, pain, and loss finally began to feel like it had some measure of resolution. For weeks leading up to the trial, the small town had been buzzing with whispers of the treachery that had occurred behind the closed doors of the Turner family. Henry's actions were incomprehensible to the people who had known him as a man of status, wealth, and influence. The man who had once been a well-respected member of the community had become the face of cruelty and deception. But for Samuel, the trial was not about vengeance. It wasn't about seeking a public spectacle or a harsh punishment for the man who had tried to kill him. Instead, Samuel's eyes were focused on something far more important: justice, the kind that came from truth, accountability, and the restoration of peace. The road to this point had been long and painful, filled with moments of anger, grief, and uncertainty, but Samuel had never wavered from his belief that justice was the only path forward. Not just for him, but for the sake of his family. On the day of the trial, the courthouse was packed with locals who had heard about the scandal surrounding Henry's betrayal. Samuel and Clara sat quietly in the front row, their hearts heavy but resolute. Clara held Samuel's hand tightly, both of them knowing that this moment was as important as any they had faced before. It wasn't just about holding Henry accountable for his actions. It was about showing the world that the Turner family could rise above the hatred and deceit that had once threatened to destroy them. As the trial began, the evidence against Henry was overwhelming. The forged death certificate, the poisoned drink, the false claims, and the attempts to bury Samuel alive were all presented to the court in chilling detail. The prosecutor's voice echoed in the courtroom as each piece of evidence was laid bare for everyone to see. It was a damning case, one that painted Henry as nothing more than a power-hungry, selfish man willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood for money and status. But despite the anger that surely simmered in Samuel's chest, he felt no hatred for the man who had done this to him. Henry was no longer the brother-in-law he had once trusted. He was a man driven by greed and selfishness, and he was about to face the consequences of his actions. Samuel knew, deep down, that the man who stood before him today was a hollow shell of the person he once thought he knew. The judge, after hearing the full testimony, delivered a swift verdict. Henry Jimenez was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder, falsification of documents, and conspiracy to kill. As the gavel fell, there was a moment of stunned silence in the room. It wasn't just the end of Henry's reign of deception, it was a symbol of the power of truth and justice. The trial had been long and grueling, but in the end, the law had prevailed. Samuel, despite the victory of justice, did not feel the satisfaction he had once imagined. It wasn't the kind of triumph that would heal the wounds in his soul or erase the painful memories. Instead, it was a recognition that justice, while necessary, was not the end of his journey. For Samuel, the true power of justice lay not in the punishment of his brother-in-law, but in the opportunity to rebuild his life, his family, and his peace of mind. As Henry was led away in handcuffs, Samuel's heart remained calm. He did not celebrate the defeat of his enemy, nor did he gloat over the retribution. Samuel understood that the true cost of Henry's betrayal had already been paid by him, by Clara, and by their daughter Lucy. The pain of the past could not be erased by the fall of Henry. But at least now, there was a sense of closure. At least now, they could move on. It was Clara who whispered the words Samuel needed to hear. "We've been through so much," she said, her voice soft but filled with strength. "And now we can start fresh. We can rebuild, not just our home, but our lives." Samuel nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Yes, Clara, we can." But even as justice had been served, Samuel knew that one crucial step remained something that was even more important than any legal ruling. It was forgiveness. He had never truly understood what it meant to forgive until this moment. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened or letting Henry off the hook. It was about choosing not to carry the weight of hatred with him, about releasing himself from the chains of bitterness that could have kept him bound forever. He knew that holding on to his anger would only harm him and those he loved. It was an act of love, of healing, and of personal freedom to forgive not just for Henry, but for himself. As Samuel walked out of the courthouse, he was not the same man who had entered it. He had faced death, betrayal, and the cruelty of a loved one, and yet he had emerged from it with a heart that was open to healing, to hope, and to the future. Samuel understood now that justice wasn't simply about punishment. It was about allowing room for growth, for understanding, and ultimately for forgiveness. And while it was true that the past could never be undone, Samuel knew that the future was theirs to shape. Together, as a family, they would move forward, and they would do so with the knowledge that love, truth, and forgiveness were the true forces that bound them together. In the days that followed, the Turner family found peace. They had endured the hardest of trials, but they had emerged stronger. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the defining features of their lives. Now, it was the love they had for each other, their unwavering bond that guided them forward. Justice had been served, and in its wake, there was room for healing. Samuel and Clara had rediscovered each other, and together with Lucy, they had learned that while the world could be harsh and unforgiving, the strength of family and the power of forgiveness could overcome anything, opening a new future. With the final verdict delivered and the heavy burden of the past finally lifted, the Turner family stood at a crossroads. The ordeal that had consumed their lives for so long, the deception, the betrayal, the pain had come to an end. And yet, the road ahead was uncertain. After all the suffering, the wounds still needed time to heal. But now, Samuel, Clara, and their daughter Lucy had the freedom to rebuild their lives, this time with a renewed understanding of what truly mattered. The Turner family's first steps into this new chapter of their lives were not marked by grand gestures or immediate changes in circumstances. It wasn't the material things that they needed, nor the wealth or the status that so often define success in the eyes of the world. What they truly needed was peace. They needed to rediscover what it meant to live as a family, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over them. For Samuel, the journey of rebuilding was as much internal as it was external. He had spent so much of his life focused on providing for his family, on being the hardworking, reliable man who kept things together. He had done so much for his family, but he had never truly allowed himself to live in the moment, to appreciate the simple joys of life. After everything he had been through, Samuel realized that happiness didn't come from just surviving. He needed to learn how to live again, to experience the beauty of life without fear, without guilt. Clara, too, was deeply changed by the events that had transpired. She had always been strong, the pillar that held their family together. But in the wake of Samuel's death and the traumatic loss of her brother, she had faced a depth of grief she had never anticipated. But Clara was also a woman of immense resilience. While the memories of what had happened would never leave her, she understood that she couldn't dwell on the past forever. The future, after all, was something they could still shape. Together, Clara and Samuel began the process of healing their hearts. The emotional scars would take time to fade, but they were both committed to moving forward. Samuel's recovery in the hospital was not just physical. He had been given a second chance at life, and he was determined not to waste it. He began to cherish the small moments he had with Clara and Lucy, finding joy in their shared laughter, in the simple act of walking through their fields as a family, hand in hand. Lucy, too, had been deeply affected by the events. At such a young age, she had witnessed things no child should ever have to endure. But the love of her parents had been a beacon in the darkness. Lucy had watched her mother and father face the worst kind of betrayal, and yet she saw them emerge from it stronger, more united, and more determined than ever. The love they shared became her anchor, and she carried that love with her as she navigated her own feelings of confusion and sadness. One of the first steps the Turner family took toward their new future was to return to their home. After everything that had happened, their house had felt like a shell, empty, cold, and distant. But as they walked through the familiar doors, it was as if the weight of the past lifted off their shoulders. The walls that had once been a symbol of all they had lost now became a symbol of their resilience. They began to fix up their home together. Samuel worked alongside Clara, tending to the farm, fixing the roof, planting new crops, and creating new spaces in their home for moments of laughter, rest, and peace. It wasn't about the house itself, it was about what it represented: a fresh start, a chance to rebuild. They filled the house with warmth, with love, with life. Over time, their small farm began to thrive again, not just because of Samuel's hard work, but because it was filled with new energy. Clara, with her unwavering strength, supported him every step of the way, providing not only practical help, but also emotional support. She reminded Samuel, time and time again, of the importance of taking the time to enjoy the fruits of their labor. For too long, they had focused on survival. Now it was time to focus on living. In the evenings, the family would sit together by the fireplace, telling stories of old times and dreams of the future. They laughed together, cried together, and found solace in the simple joys of being a family once more. The pain of the past was still there, lingering like a shadow, but it no longer defined them. The future was something they could control, and they chose to fill it with love, hope, and joy. Samuel, now fully recovered, found himself focusing on more than just the day-to-day survival of the family. He began to invest time in his own passions. He began writing again, jotting down his thoughts and experiences. He had always loved to write, but the demands of life had kept him from it. Now, with his family's future ahead of him, he felt compelled to document the journey they had been on, the lessons they had learned, and the strength they had discovered within themselves. It was a form of therapy for him, a way to process his emotions and reflect on how far they had come. But it was Clara's quiet strength that continued to hold the family together. She had seen the worst of humanity, but she also saw the best of it in the way her family had come together. She was a woman who understood that no amount of hardship could ever break them, as long as they stuck together. And she made sure, every day, that Samuel and Lucy never forgot that. Their life was far from perfect, but it was theirs. They had learned that love wasn't about avoiding hardship, it was about facing it together. And with that understanding, they were able to move forward into a future filled with possibility. Samuel, Clara, and Lucy stood at the threshold of their new life, ready to embrace whatever came next. Together, they would continue to build their future, step by step, with love as their foundation and hope as their guide. And as they walked forward, hand in hand, the light of a brighter tomorrow was shining ahead of them. The dark days were behind them, and they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it as a family united, strong, and unbreakable. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story on Stories TH. We hope you enjoyed the journey of survival, betrayal, and redemption. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing content. Your support means the world to us.